Bonjour, my name is Veronique Audette, and we are in the Wiki, where we discuss the nuance behind the headlines. Today, we're discussing part 2 of our 5-part series on COVID-19 with context and compassion, entitled An Economy of Numbers with a Human Toll, and we're going to be taking this on with our lovely Scott. Welcome.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. Just before we go to break, I do want to inform everyone, wherever you're watching, that we stream live on msmu.me every day, where you can interact with us, send us questions, and really see the headline news, in the wiki, interviews, correspondence. So we do send that out to around the world on different social media platforms. But if you go to msmu.me, channel 1, boom, you'll see us there streaming. So with that said, we'll be right back after the short break.
Disclaimer alert, we are going to be discussing facts and figures today from a journalistic standpoint. Please have a look at our article for all of the reference material. However, we are going to be inserting our human perspective and maybe diving into the realm of speculation, as we are having a more dialectic conversational approach, giving context and a broader view of this issue, specifically the economy, COVID-19 and the lockdown model.
Yeah, our In the Wiki gives us more of the editorial aspect to have conversation, and a lot of what we want is the conversation out there. So on these other various platforms, this is up for viewer discretion. It can contradict some of sort of the mass narrative that is sort of out there. So viewer discretion is advised.
Now, it serves us to briefly provide an overview of the previous In the Wiki and the first article in our series, A Problematic Lockdown Model. Now, to summarize, the lockdown model that shut down Canada's economy was entitled Report 9. It was written by Neil Ferguson of the Imperial College of London and has since been credibly criticized, and some would say debunked, for its significant coding problems as well as potential financial biases. Now, the coding problems are as such. It was an archaic and extremely limited code, which was revised by Microsoft and BitChute prior to being released, and even this revised code actually received a significant amount of criticism, detailing that it was not adequate to espouse this type of an epidemiological model. From the funding bias perspective, the Imperial College of London, specifically the areas of interest that Neil Ferguson participates in academically, specifically malaria control in sub-Saharan Africa, received a $79 million donation from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation the same month that the report was published. So this funding bias is credible, and we don't know to what degree this institution and this individual is beholden to Bill and Melinda Gates. So that's something to consider, especially given the fact that the consequences of this report, which is an extreme lockdown model, shutting down hundreds and thousands of Canadian small businesses and businesses internationally, directly benefits the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, given that they are heavily invested in the vaccine. And in the report, and more broadly in the corporate media, we see that the vaccine is touted as the only credible solution to mediate this lockdown crisis. We're actually going to cover the vaccine in more depth in another In the Wiki, an article, which I'm currently working on. But hold tight for that exhilarating perspective.
And one thing I want to bring towards sort of like why the first one really did cover Report 9, and how this one is actually going to cover the economic and psychological aspects of what a lockdown means, is because really in the actual Report 9, it said it's going to exclude this from the report. It's going to say this is a sort of way to deal with the virus spread, is lock down everything. But in the article itself, in the report, it really just said to do this and kind of with their model, we are not going to look at any economic or psychological impacts. So with that, we'll do that and kind of look and kind of see what is really out there. A lot is covered, but we're going to piece it all together so we get one clear view, because that really this narrative should have been presented to us first.
Yeah, you are correct to say that specifically in the report, they detail that they are not going to be considering any broader impacts of an extreme mandated lockdown measure. And they also assert specifically on multiple occasions that extreme lockdown measures are the only mediating solution to COVID-19 crisis until a vaccine is made available, without, again, considering the, let's say, indirect consequences of this lockdown. But we're going to go into that in depth, so thank you for bringing that up. We're going to be investigating this aspect of the lockdown with 3 pillars of investigation. Firstly, we're going to be looking at the economic impact of lockdown measures on GDP, unemployment, specific qualifying metrics to see where our economy stands today as a result of the lockdown, and also where it stood at the height of the lockdown. Secondly, we're going to be talking about indirect mortality caused by economic turmoil, again resulting from the COVID-19 lockdown. This specifically correlates to opioid events, suicide, food insecurity, so let's call it indirect mortality. And finally, we're going to be focusing upon populations disproportionately affected by the lockdown consequences versus those threatened by the virus itself. So here we're focusing on youth, racialized workers, and so on. So that is going to be the focus of our discussion today. So let's jump right in. It is a fact that Canada's implementation of the COVID-19 extreme lockdown model has led to the largest economic contraction on record since the Great Depression, possibly before.
Yeah, I mean, really, the government stopped all types of income, which is kind of a huge thing, where they just stopped ways of tax, like business stopped working, so people weren't buying, people weren't paying taxes, and that sort of like HST aspect here. So yeah, we really kind of stopped the income, and still to this day are just throwing out checks left, right, and center.
Yeah, we're going to be covering that actually briefly in order to, again, play devil's advocate and see the full picture. We're going to be talking about the government response to the COVID-19 lockdown, and I'll just tease this again for a future in the wiki. We're actually looking at the COVID-19 economic response and how it plays into this. And throughout all of these documentation, our policymakers are constantly patting themselves on the back for the adequacy of their economic recovery and supporting small businesses despite undue turmoil, as we're going to see. So this is a great segue into this, actually. This is, again, within our article with all of the correlating reference material, so it is legitimate. You can see here that according to Statistics Canada, the real gross domestic product, the GDP, contracted at an annualized rate of 38.7% in the second quarter of 2020, which is when the first lockdown mandate came into effect and was at its peak. This downsizing, according to StatsCan, is attributed to the forced shutdowns of businesses considered non-essential, restrictions on travel, and border closures affecting tourism. So you can see here in the chart, this is significantly more statistically relevant than the 2008 financial crisis by orders of magnitude. And this is a contraction that has never been seen, even the Great Depression. I think we don't even have quantifiable metrics to make this type of a correlation, but it's a serious contraction, and small businesses are feeling it all from coast to coast to coast.
Yeah, and that's kind of really interesting in the contraction that it's really much felt on the lower end, and the ones who are actually like expanded are on the higher end. So a lot of more of like a funneling of wealth than really the contraction of the economy in certain senses, where it's just like you see small businesses and industries contract. We're in December right now. You can't go to any small business to like walk in Toronto to buy. You have to go online, or it becomes a pain. You don't actually get that joy of walking around and actually like picking things out that other people have picked out. So yeah, they really hurt, while Amazon and all these large sort of corporations, Costco and stuff, really get to reaping the benefits of this. And it's it's going to be really felt for generations to come.
Such a great point. And I would love to know, to discuss or ask an economist this. To what degree has this redistribution of wealth that we are now currently witnessing affecting the GDP? Because GDP is largely supported by small business, as we'll see in a few frames. All of these multinationals that are receiving the benefit of this wealth redistribution have, offshore accounts, are, functioning in a decentralized way, whereas they're not really beholden to the Canadian government because they're multinational corporations with, this is a whole other issue that we'll cover at length. But if you're curious, Corbett Report does a really great job covering economic redistribution and disparity in this time. These are all questions that are relevant and contribute to this pandemic significantly. Now, this is another metric that we can use to analyze the economic downturn resulting not from the virus necessarily, but from the mandated lockdowns. We can see in April of 2020, employment decreased by 3 million in Canada. And this employment rate, doesn't include people who have lost hours, who have lost access to their jobs. So people leaving the job market is much larger even than this 3 million. Keep going. Okay, and unemployment rates hit record high in May, reaching 13.7%. And we actually have some really interesting scientific evidence showing what the suicide and mortality rates of the mental health crisis and how that is affected by unemployment. So we're going to be diving into that in a bit. Further, as per our previous point, you can see here that on average 1 in 7 businesses are at risk of closing. Now this was in July of this was in July of 2019. And so this is an older piece, and this was before the second lockdown happened in localized area on a sliding scale. So at that point it was 158,000 businesses. Now that continues to climb every day as Toronto is locked down.
Especially like this massive, again, shutting local small businesses down during Christmas season. It's really kind of heartless in sort of aspects of there's a lot of touting of close the big box stores down, keep small businesses open. The government still hasn't been able to produce actual sort of data on why it's the small businesses and restaurants. And kind of one thing about Addison Barbecue, which did make it international, was one thing I was there when I interviewed him. He said he locked down the first time, and Doug Ford said he's going to provide that data, going to prove this is why we have to shut down restaurants and indoor eating. And I think it was 2 out of 10,000 cases came from restaurants, and that's where really Adam got really inflamed, because that's not proof. And with a lot of this, the data and the models don't correlate.
And one thing that I'm going to allow myself to get a little bit, since we did do the disclosure, I'm going to allow myself to get a little pissed off right now, because honestly, we do have data that shows that small changes, and this is within the COVID binder, and again, all of the information is available to you on our website. There are scientific papers proving that mortality could have been reduced, mortality in the senior population in elderly care homes could have been reduced by simply reducing the number of beds per room from 4 to 2. And that would have reduced mortality something around 50%. I'd have to double check my specific metric. And those changes have not been done. So we know, it's in here if you want to look at it.
I saw something about and it's interesting, we have the world, and there are hospitals sort of overflowing around the world. And it's in December, so this is not actually out of history, what's happening. But when we look at Canada and the data, where the deaths are really 10,000 were in senior citizens' homes, and very little deaths were happening outside of the home. So
those measures are still not being taken. Excuse me, but I've been watching Parle View before they take their 2-month holiday break, and
they just did today.
Yeah, exactly. I've been so blessed to be able to just stream, the Liberal government patting themselves on the back for not adequately supporting Canadians and saying, oh yeah, we've given more than any other country proportionally to GDP except for Japan. Okay, that's great. But how does that manifest in actual front lines of these elderly care homes when you have people losing their parents, their grandparents, having to call for, 3 days straight to only show up and find out that they've passed away already and that they were thirsty and weren't getting basic needs of food and water. I mean, Bill C9 wasn't, passed, or the amendments to Bill C9 that were requested were not passed. What was included in Bill C9 were wage subsidies that the Liberal government itself actually utilized. So I'm sorry, but for these politicians to say that they're taking adequate measures to protect our population based on the data is, in my opinion, not correct. And I'm pissed off because a lot of wisdom keepers, elders, our grandparents, our parents are passing, and we're just being demanded to comply by their mortality statistics hanging above our head and saying that if you don't comply 100%, you're responsible. I'm not responsible, okay? It's the policies and procedures that were not followed and that continue to not be followed that are, affecting these people. So I'm pissed.
Well, it's
I'm
also
straight up pissed.
I mean, on that, where it's like, if you don't follow this, then you're the one killing sort of grandma and these things. And it's like, that sort of logic and that kind of what we're going into with like the mental health, suicides, abuse. It's like, does that make people accountable to that? Like, if you don't want the lockdown, then you're killing grandma. But if you do want the lockdown, are we really advocating for the effects of the lockdown really happening, and how this sort of tidal wave of really removing humanity, all the inhumane aspects of life come to fruition. And so we're really actually seeing this sort of bubbling and brewing on many aspects and many parts. Not just like, I mean, right now we're on the economics and so the businesses, and this is not like, this is lifelong. So we have sort of deaths, and we knew from Report 9 that this is going to really affect our senior citizens and the aging population. And to whatever level, yes, they will pass. But right now, with what we're going to go into, this is something that's going to stay for the whole life. Yeah, and we're going to touch on this on the last part of our Inn The Wiki, which actually is only going to be available to those streaming on MSMU. Because it is at the end trail and we're already at 20 minutes and I feel that we're 3. Yeah. I just wanted to correct something. This is the front page of the study here, and it's not 50%, excuse me. It would have averted 20% of infections and 18.7% of COVID deaths if they would have reduced the number of beds in elderly care homes from 4 to 2, and this has still not been implemented. So yeah, again, like, to all this sort of credit of like actually looking at it from a health perspective, not really sort of a draconian perspective, but if like this is the data that we have vulnerable people really exposed, like the way we deal with our senior citizens is atrocious, or people who are vulnerable. It's like right now, if you get COVID or have that we have these safe sort of places, a hotel you can go. It's like, well, what about taking all the senior citizens from all these homes, putting up in the hotels? They're isolated, one person per room. And allow like a caregiver from their family to come and also be supported and receive universal basic income, or be financially compensated for their participation or something. That way you're creating an isolated circumstance. I mean, there are so many creative solutions that we could think of, but clearly... Do you know what would help with that? Democracy. Oh. But we're not in a democracy. We are in a constitutional monarchy. But in the sense of at least being in Parliament to talk about it and having this private council that Doug Ford has zero legal accountability. And that's the thing. He is pretty much, in essence, some type of king, where he goes into private council. We don't get to see the data. We didn't even get to see the data that Toronto sends. These are all models getting sort of sent to them from somewhere. And they make their policies on that, and the policies come from somewhere. And not in open and transparent ways. Well, we do know that
Neil Ferguson's Imperial College of London's Report 9 did specifically motivate and inspire Canada's lockdown model. And because it's self realized, even there's a timeline in our article showing at least the circumstantial evidence to show that Justin Trudeau followed specifically the guidelines as presented by Neil Ferguson. Moving on specifically to small businesses.
Well, before I think let's maybe just have a little commercial break here.
Take a breather.
Take a breather. Let's get we're getting fired up here a little bit.
Well,
and again, we are on slide 7 of 52. So we'll see how we make this whole thing work. This will probably be a 1 of 10 part for a 10 part or something. So anyways, we'll be right back and
stick with us.
Stick with us here. Thank you.
We're going to be speaking with a very, very talented artist. Her name is Natasha Kudashkina. Natasha is a multidisciplinary artist based here in Toronto. She paints, she performs, and she writes. She does it all.
So body art is a wonderful gateway and something incredibly beautiful. And sometimes you have to live a little longer and experience something else in order to finish something you're currently working on.
So how do you use social media and new technology to promote your artwork?
Yes, it's a good reminder. After you make it, share it. Like share yourself with the world. It's not like I thought that this will be my long-term career. For me, it's my life.
Natasha, are there any projects that you're working on at the moment that we can look forward to?
Yes. So.
Welcome back.
I'm Scott Cameron, and
I'm Veronique Audette.
And we're still here in the Wiki talking about the economic models and really from COVID-19 and mental health and really these other two aspects that weren't covered in the original sort of conversation. So,
absolutely. So just to summarize our previous rant, small businesses which employ over 70% of Canadians are at risk currently. And 56% of small businesses surveyed before the beginning of the second lockdown would not easily survive a second lockdown. So 56% of businesses surveyed would not easily survive a second lockdown. So we'll see what that means for the 70% of Canadians that are employed by small business. We touched upon this previously, where we are currently experiencing the largest redistribution of wealth from small businesses to corporate oligarchies such as Amazon. This is despite the fact that small businesses are the backbone of our economy. Now, given the mandated lockdown model, small businesses are forced to close because they're deemed non-essential. People and consumers are forced to utilize services such as Amazon in order to be able to continue living their daily life. And this is, again, despite the fact that Amazon facilities have seen large breakouts in all of their facilities from the beginning of the pandemic onwards. This headline is an example of such, where there was over 1,000 employees actually infected with COVID-19.
And there's one thing I want to bring up, and it's on my screen actually by Vicky Lee, Amazon, Make Amazon Pay aspect. And it's really kind of one thing where you see like COVID, they say it can last like 3 days on surfaces. And it's like you have next day delivery and you have massive infections happening in these places. So having these centralized mass sort of distribution centers and even Costco and that really actually kind of is in a sense a super spreader. These big box stores are super spreaders in my mind, because really Amazon, you have people coughing, all sorts of stuff, packages going out, next day it's there, you're in your home, you're not getting fresh air, so then there's a place for it all to thrive. And yeah.
Keep in mind that the contact tracing apps and the metrics that they use to measure super spreader events are all geared towards reinforcing the bias that is put forth by the lockdown. So on Statistics Canada, you won't see, big box store as an area of contact, but you'll see workplaces, you'll see other areas. Have a look, you'll see how the bias is further reinforced. Moving on, on the subject of small businesses being forced to close, you'll see this in our article, that 27% of businesses polled could not cover October's rent without rent relief. This poll happened mid-October, I believe, and 30% of businesses needing rent relief have not been able to access it. So we're going to briefly discuss the subject of Canada's economic response to the mandated lockdown model in the form of public relief funds. Now, the Canadian government did put forth a $90 billion loan program and instated multiple relief funds, including the CFIB, which is the Canadian Federation for Independent Businesses, including the CRCB, CRB, CEWS, etc., etc. I encourage you to do some research on that subject. Going back, we want to assert that the Canadian Federation for Independent Businesses polled Canadian small businesses and found that 40% of respondents agreed with the statement that says, my business has sector-specific challenges that are not being addressed through government relief programs. So we do know that despite their patting themselves on the back, a lot of small businesses are feeling the crunch right now during the mandated lockdowns.
Yeah, I mean, like even where we work, I think we're down 50% staff. It's really, and then the aspect of the relief is not, a lot of it's just like loans and these, like it's just like you're going down into a hole and here's some loans. So it's like these will need to get paid back.
Well, even with the CRB, one of our team members now have even asserted that, you know, some of the rules have changed and people have been receiving letters saying that you're going to have to pay back a majority or a certain percentage that you've received. There were reports of letters being just put out saying, you know, you might not have been eligible for the CRB. Now, please,
for it, yeah.
Exactly,
Another
please be prepared.
Here.
Yeah. Exactly. So here are, we're kind of jumping back and forth right now, but here are some credible observations on Bill C9, which is the bill that introduced the Canadian emergency rent subsidy. And you'll see that this is a list of very compelling points demonstrating that businesses that are new can't access this program. Maximum cap on subsidy reduces the level of support for businesses with multiple locations. This is all very tedious, but it's an extensive, detailed report showing how a lot of businesses have sector-specific challenges that aren't being addressed currently.
And I think I really want to make one point. We did actually talk about it a little bit before. Get the camera on me here. In the aspect of like really small businesses and paying things, and what is not talked about, especially some person on our staff watches mainstream media all the time, and it's the aspect of like the banks and really where they are in all this and how are they suffering. Like banks don't get COVID, they don't have to stop, they're not worrying about their mortgage payments, they deferred it, but like the aspect of like going to businesses, you can't actually earn any sort of income, but now also you have to continue to the actual debts and like up to the sort of requirements of the debts. And a lot of people actually through this whole thing have incurred a lot of debts, including, I mean, our whole nation, and people being $10,000 in debt. And I mean, this is like really, this one was in September, saying that every single person in Canada is $10,000 more in debt. And I mean, this is just like a projection on wherever, but we are a lot more in debt than that. So
and this is problematic.
Debt, government debt, just debt everywhere.
This is problematic considering some of the leaked reports showcasing what the actual agenda is for COVID-19. Again, this is purely speculative, but these reports include something like a Great Global Reset, whereas debt is forgiven in order to create a digitized currency and the abdication of property. So
it's about Klaus Schwab.
I don't know how to say it.
But this is actually like from the Alberta MP talked about this, and the aspect that is written that this whole digital currency, will forgive all debt, you own nothing, but you become sort of slaves, because it's not that everyone owns nothing, you own nothing. Who
and
owns
the top
it
1%.
all? and that sort of thing. So again, this is written documentation. And
it's even in WHO, World Economic Forum. I mean, this type of rhetoric has been happening extensively, and researchers have been criticized, surprisingly, for just reporting on the facts. And I mean, we have to say this is speculation because otherwise we're just going to have the elbow dropped on us. But
our editors will come in.
yeah. But this is it begs the question, right? Is the economic downturn the feature or the flaw of this age? Is this?
What do you mean by that? Is it the feature or the flaw?
So a lot of people within the conventional narrative will say, well, COVID-19 is the feature of this pandemic, and the flaw is the financial downturn. Like, the flaw is the necessary consequence of locking down, the economic downturn is the necessary consequence of locking down, and that is an undesired consequence of the virus because we have to lock down in order to save people's lives.
Where is this thing here?
Now,
where you have like the emoji of the tidal wave?
Yeah. Now, just to finish my thought, what I mean to say is that according to some people, and this is further validated by the fact that COVID-19 could have been formulated in a lab, and we're actually going to talk about this briefly, although if you want us to go at this subject at length, please let us know in the comments below because we'd love to cover this, that perhaps this could be the perfect framing in order to create an economic situation whereas there is a redistribution of wealth and power, and there is a digitization of currency, there is an implementation of a global currency program, and so on. So that's a question that we beckon for you to answer within yourself. I mean, what is the purpose of COVID-19? Is it?
Well, again, we're alluding to a lot of things by saying that, and it's just a major thing too to talk about. I mean, the Wuhan labs and actually where funding, and really the Bill and Melinda Gates, and there's so much in the wiki. We're gonna have one in the wiki every day streaming on MSMU. So if you really want to get kind of cutting edge stuff, see us there. There is an app too, so you can watch it on your phone. But like really, one thing is like with the funding and people who are like this whole aspect in 2008, the financial crisis, and really this
where nobody was held accountable.
Yeah, and that's
millions of lives.
And the people who should be held accountable are the ones that become the saviors. It's somewhat of an abusive sort of aspect in relationship, and really to look into aspects of like Iceland, where they actually threw their bankers in jail, renationalized their bank, and really actually took hold of it as citizens and said no, because the main thing, this debt is not ours, not yet. Right? The whole thing is like banks actually are the ones who are creating the money, creating the debt, and it's their gamble. It is their sort of aspect that, and then maybe this is the COVID that they can take, because this is not our debt, but it will be assigned to us.
Well, that's what the World Economic Forum says, that COVID-19 is a happenstance, perfect situation for a great global reset.
Problem, reaction, solution, yeah.
Yeah, it just happens to emerge, so we're of course going to seize upon this opportunity for an economic reset. But they've been talking about an economic reset for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, that MP really talked about when he's like, no, this is in his book, talks all about this opportunity, but where he was just like, from Alberta, he was just like, no, the opportunity now is actually how we can actually help the vulnerable, help actually people get back on their feet, not be like, oh my Lord, this is a great time to just reset everything. And maybe it is, but maybe the conversation and not having the people who caused the problem be the solutions. I don't know.
That would be nice. It would be nice to not have the people who credibly could have caused the problem benefit financially directly, such as is exactly the case with Bill Gates. But let's move on to specifically the things at hand here and today, the correlations and the links between the lockdown mandate and excess mortality, specifically in the areas of mental health as well as opioid use, which are two epidemics that we've been experiencing before the pandemic.
Well, opioid use, but it's like addictions. of
Yes.
all. Like it's just.
In fact, the Canadian Journal of Psychiatry has synthesized the analysis of nearly a dozen primary Canadian psychiatrists, and they describe a parallel epidemic of mental health problems triggered by the viral outbreak and provide recommendations to support the special needs of certain population subgroups, which are only further disenfranchised because they are living within special conditions, whereas a lockdown specifically affects them in a more extreme manner. For example, if you're housing insecure, if you're income insecure, if you are in recovery and you need access to brick and mortar, methadone, you need access to treatment, you need access to support groups, all of that has been suspended, and yet the LCBO is allowed to remain open, et cetera, et cetera. So the Canadian Journal of Psychiatry concludes that, quote, a sustainable public policy requires both a rational public health strategy and a rational economic strategy to curtail the virus and prevent widespread poverty. And that means not enforcing a mandatory lockdown model on all people in every circumstance, because that's going to create a higher degree of mortality within those that are already vulnerable. This is made actually evident in this published report by the Canadian Government of Canada in 2020.
Pop my screen on the camera there.
What a great example. Yes. Yes.
And a lot to the whole thing, this lockdown strategy was one thing too you don't know, and World Health Organization and what it's really saying here is that it's that sort of initial step. Let's lock things down, look at things, and reevaluate. But there's been zero reevaluation, from my sense, of the broader perspective, bringing in actually other professionals in that to actually come to the table and debate. I don't see it.
Yeah, I mean, it would be conceivable to, validate a temporary lockdown until we can discern more, have more information about adequate prevention measures for COVID-19. But that's not exactly what happened. And you can have a reference to our lockdown episode for more information on that. Within this specific framework, and again, this content is available on our website, they really do a great job at looking at COVID-19 from an equity approach, looking at who's actually affected by COVID-19 lockdowns, although there are some, I think, credible criticisms within this report. But they assert that those with excellent self-perceived mental health decreased by 20% when compared to respondents from 2018 statistics. So that's just a statistic to usher us into this new age. A few stats that I would love to get your impressions on. First of all, half of the world's population lived under strict confinement conditions in April of 2020. Over 300 million full-time jobs were lost globally in the second quarter of 2020. And this is all provided by the Government of Canada with references. By the end of 2020, global economic growth could contract by 3 to 6%, increasing the risk of a recession to rival the 1930s Great Depression. A lot of economists have actually already made that correlation and find that we are actually there. And finally, 87% of the global student population was affected by school closures by the end of March 2020.
Yeah, in my reflection, it's just actually one slide of probably maybe 40 of sort of the what this actually does. Again, removing humanity is where the lockdown is. People can't be sort of liberated to go out and be free within their ways to make educated choices on this aspect. And actually a clip I do want to play here of this is, again, if you want to catch sort of our newest stuff, we're on Telegram. It's an end-to-end encryption, uncensored sort of platform, and you can find us. Just do In24 in the search and you'll find the different groups. So
we've got a news scan.
The news scan is what we all pitch to the editor. So the transparency aspect of In24 is we want you to see from a pitch of a story all the way through to when we do our hour.
And ultimately, we want you to participate. Yeah. We want to have the relevant questions come from the people, come from those that are actually being affected by these metrics every day, and that's you.
Yeah, and what we talk about, one sort of aspect is like to have like we have truth in journalism to us. I mean, truth and integrity in journalism comes from the transparency and accessibility. Hence why we have wiki codes where you can actually search through all our platforms, get all the information. And really just before we actually go to our break here, I do want to play this one part. I mean, it's not so much on the aspect of the mortality, but it's one on the conversation of like our treatment. Are we doing,
Well, we are going to be covering, mortality rates and how they're affected by preferential treatments. Some treatments have been prioritized. It's another in the wiki, yeah.
Okay, maybe I'll just hold it.
Okay. Yeah, so we actually only have a few minutes left in our show that's available to everybody on YouTube, BitChute, etc. Again, if you want to go really, follow us with the rest of this discussion, you're welcome to follow us and, see us on msmu.me. But we're actually going to leave you with a little juicy kind of summary. And I think this is really, really relevant to the story, because if it is true that COVID-19 is lab created, there are some pretty serious implications. So we're actually going to follow a few credible sources of specifically the origin of COVID-19. And we're doing this because in the report that we're covering currently, they actually specifically assert that COVID-19 is a novel infectious disease believed to have evolved from a virus moving from bats to human through an intermediary animal host that is yet to be identified.
Well, that has been quite proven wrong. I mean, even
we'll see.
Even the bat that they talk about is nowhere near that sort of market.
The evolution of the bat.
Yes.
You like that?
Oh, that's that.
You get it?
I get it. Okay.
Yeah. Nerd note. I'm about to sneeze.
That's awkward.
I got it. I'm suppressing it.
Yeah.
So here we're actually going to discuss very briefly, again, if you want us to go over this at length, we would love to do so. Just let us know in the comments. So this is a revised, peer-reviewed study specifically detailing and demonstrating the genetic structure of SARS-CoV-2 does not rule out a laboratory origin. This further reinforces Harvard professors, Stanford professors, epidemiologists, virologists, researchers actually having a lot of trouble publishing their research, which further reinforces the lab origin story of SARS-CoV-2. And again, if it did originate in a lab, it does reinforce the narrative that this could possibly be part of a greater global agenda. It's something to consider. It's something to include in your mind.
Yeah, and just again, right before we break on that, anyway, we're going to go into all this sort of stuff and why we actually are on msmu.me, is we can talk about this stuff and we're not going to be sort of
censored.
We've already had 2 videos censored, and they're not even really we're interviewing people, we're getting people's opinion, and it really states that if we don't follow the guideline from the World Health Organization, that's what they just only want to have that narrative go out, which is not journalism. It is for us to go and talk, and if we're continuing on with this narrative of COVID-19, but actually not really going into it, that's what we're here for. So check us out, the rest of this, msmu.me. We'll see you there, and we'll be back after this break. Have a good one.